The story of the Holocaust is often told in numbers. 6 million Jews murdered. Millions more, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, systematically destroyed. But numbers, on their own, can feel distant. The truth becomes more real, and far more disturbing, when you look at the methods, the mindset, and the cold logic behind it. At the center of it all was Nazi Germany, a regime that turned ideology into machinery. Their goal was not just to kill, it was to industrialize death. That distinction matters. In the early years of the regime, before extermination camps reached their most efficient form, the Nazis experimented. Not in the sense of scientific curiosity, but in the most twisted interpretation of it. They tested methods of control, punishment, and killing, treating human beings as disposable material. Electricity was one of the tools explored, not because it was humane or quick, but because they were searching for what worked best at scale. There are accounts, including survivor testimonies and post-war investigations, describing electrified fences in camps like Auschwitz. These fences carried high-voltage currents. Officially, they were meant to prevent escape. In reality, they became instruments of death. Prisoners called it going to the wire. Some were driven to it by despair. Others were forced toward it by guards. The electricity did not just kill, it became part of the psychological terror of the camps. It was always there, visible, humming, a boundary that reminded prisoners there was no safe direction. Even the air around it carried fear. This wasn't chaos. It was design. Another camp, Belzec, is often remembered as one of the sites of Operation Reinhard, the systematic murder of Jews in occupied Poland. While Belzec is primarily known for its gas chambers, stories have circulated about earlier or alternative killing methods being tested. Some accounts speak of crude and brutal attempts to use electricity in controlled spaces. Whether every detail of those stories can be fully verified or not, what is clear from historical records is that the Nazis were constantly experimenting with methods before settling on gas as their primary means of mass murder. And that decision, to use gas, was not driven by morality. It was driven by efficiency. Gas chambers allowed them to kill large numbers of people quickly, with fewer resources, and with less psychological strain on the perpetrators compared to mass shootings or other direct methods. It was a logistical solution to a moral abyss. That is what makes it so chilling. The question they were trying to answer was not should we do this, but how can we do this better? Electricity, while deadly, was inconsistent, technically demanding, and less scalable. Gas, in their calculation, solved those problems. But perhaps the darkest chapter lies not just in methods of killing, but in what they called medical research. Doctors, trained professionals sworn to heal, became instruments of cruelty. Figures like Joseph Mengele and Friedrich Manecki were part of a broader system that turned camps into laboratories. Their experiments were not guided by ethics or genuine science. They were driven by ideology, curiosity without conscience, and a complete disregard for human life. Electrical shock was one of many methods used in these experiments. Prisoners were subjected to high-voltage currents to study the limits of the human body, how much stress the heart could endure, how long a person could survive under extreme conditions. These were not controlled clinical trials. They were acts of torture disguised as research. Some devices were crude, even improvised, hand-cranked generators used during interrogations or experiments. The randomness of the tools did not lessen the suffering. If anything, it added to the unpredictability and fear. Victims had no idea what would happen next, how long it would last, or whether they would survive. And survival, in many cases, was not the goal. What stands out in all of this is not just the brutality, but the mindset behind it. The Nazi system reduced people to categories, useful or useless, worthy or unworthy. Once someone was placed outside the boundary of human, anything could be justified. That is how a doctor could become an executioner. That is how engineers could design killing systems. That is how electricity, gas, and every available tool could be repurposed for destruction. It's important to be precise here. Not every story that circulates about the camps is equally documented. The Holocaust has been extensively studied, and historians rely on survivor testimonies, Nazi records, and forensic evidence to build an accurate picture. While some accounts of specific methods, like electrified rooms, are debated or less substantiated, the broader truth is undeniable. The Nazis experimented with multiple methods of killing and torture before refining their system. And that system became terrifyingly effective. The camps were not just places of death. They were systems of control. Every element, barbed wire, guard towers, uniforms, routines, was designed to strip people of identity and agency. Electricity was just one part of that machinery, but it symbolized something larger: the fusion of technology and cruelty. It's easy looking back to see the Nazis as monsters, and in many ways, their actions were monstrous. But the more uncomfortable truth is that they were also ordinary people operating within a system that normalized the unthinkable. That's the real warning, because the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers or experiments. It began with ideas, with language that dehumanized, with policies that excluded, with small steps that, over time, led to unimaginable outcomes. By the time electricity was being used in camps, by the time doctors were conducting lethal experiments, the moral collapse was already complete. So when we talk about these methods, electric fences, experimental shocks, gas chambers, we're not just talking about how people died. We're talking about how a society reached a point where such things became possible, even routine. And that's why these details matter. Not to sensationalize, but to understand. Not to shock, but to remember. Because the most frightening part of this history is not that these methods existed. It's that they were created, refined, and justified by human beings who convinced themselves it was necessary. And once that line is crossed, there are very few limits left.